Welcome to this episode of C2GDiscuss. Today we will talk about the need for net zero and the net negative emissions and the role of carbon dioxide removal in those activities. My name is János Pásztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. And I have been working on climate change for most of the last 4 decades. There is still a lot left to do, but that's been really my life, and I still wish to continue doing that. And I hope that the discussion today will also contribute to that overall goal of addressing the climate crisis. We have today with us an amazing panel of discussants, and I really look forward to our discussion. And maybe to start, I would like to ask them to introduce themselves, who they are, why they're interested in this topic, and any other sort of important issues that they would like to share with us before we get into the actual discussion. So maybe we can start with Jan Minks. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jan Minks. Thanks for having me. I'm group leader at the Mercator Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. I'm also professor for climate change and public policy at the University of Leeds. My interest in carbon dioxide removal technologies really was sparked via my work for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I was coordinating the technical support unit during the 5th assessment report, and 2 issues came out for me. One is we really need to become much better in various fields to synthesize evidence for policy. And one of the evidence gaps where I thought we need to synthesize much better was carbon dioxide removal, an issue that had not received the deserved attention. And so since then, I started working on it.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Suchi, can we go on to you now?
Yes, thank you so much, János, and thank you all for having me. I'm the Chief of Staff of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the United States Department of Energy. And so I've been working on carbon removal governance in my previous roles as well, and I'm incredibly thankful to have the opportunity to help shape key parts of this issue from the perspective of the federal government now. I'll say previously, this area really hasn't had the focus it needs for the important role that it's going to have to play in the path towards net zero emissions, and also to limit harm to climate vulnerable communities. We've seen over the past couple of years that CDR is really growing in intention on the global stage, and it's of utmost importance that we do this the right way, and we do so inclusively and transparently. And my hope is that, in my role in this administration, that I can have a hand in helping shape that.
Thank you very much, and wish you all the best for that important work. James?
Thank you, János. It's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation. Again, James Mwangi, I'm Executive Director of the Dalberg Group. We're a group of companies working globally, dedicated to the proposition that we are working towards a more inclusive and sustainable world where all people everywhere can realize their full potential. You read that mission statement and you immediately see that climate action and an economically just transition to a future more sustainable world sits at the very heart of what we do. And so over the last 3 or 4 years, I've become really convinced, particularly sitting in Africa, I usually live in Nairobi, of the fact that the way that you will create the economic opportunity that's necessary for some of the world's fastest growing labor forces is to really engage them, both in an emissions-free or low emissions growth path, but more importantly, in a set of tasks focused on carbon dioxide removal and other aspects of helping avert the world's greatest challenge. We need to put the world's biggest labor force to fight and win the battle against the world's greatest challenge. And in pursuit of that idea, I'm now serving as a Yale World Fellow here in New Haven for the next few months to hopefully refine the thinking and develop a few interventions that may allow Africa to not be just a victim or a passive actor in this climate discussion, but an active part of the long-term solution.
Thank you. And I think what I said at the beginning, we have an excellent group of discussants here. I think that's very clear. And there are already quite a few ideas that I heard that maybe we'll be able to come back during the discussion. But before getting into that discussion, let me also say a few words about the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, who we're hosting this C2GDiscuss event. We are a foundation-funded initiative, so philanthropically funded. Our mission is quite simple, is to contribute to the strengthening and building of governance frameworks for approaches that can alter the climate, such as large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. Today, we will be talking only about the carbon dioxide removal part, but we're focusing on both. When we talk about governance, we talk not just about government action to regulate activities that's included in governance, but we talk about the broader process of different parts of society, different stakeholders engaging in the process of understanding new techniques and contributing to decision making, to the development of social license, etc. So it's that broad interpretation, and I believe that's also the IPCC's interpretation of governance, this broad approach. Our work is impartial, so we're here not to promote any of these techniques, nor are we here to oppose them. Our purpose is to address governance. And one more item about our work is we work in a catalytic manner. So the idea is not that we do things, the idea is more to engage with others in different processes to have them do something and move their processes, their organizations forward on these issues. Now, part of our objective is to provide impartial evidence-based information about these techniques. We do a lot in terms of documents and infographics and things like that, but we also find ways to have different people come and express their different views, different interpretations of the same evidence base about these issues, which tend to be quite complex, not so much from a scientific and technical point of view, but from a social, economic, and political point of view. So we very much hope that this C2GDiscuss event will be able to contribute to that as well. And we have 3 individuals who will bring some very interesting different perspectives about these issues. All of this information, the printed as well as the recorded activities are found on our website, C2G.net. Now, before giving the floor to our discussants, just a few words about why we're having this discussion. I think it's important to start with the fact that we are still regrettably in a climate crisis. The climate crisis continues, and where the world is now on the average about 1.1, 1.2 degree above historical average. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is in fact quite a lot. And the impacts of that warming are increasingly clear and visible and measurable and feelable everywhere, whether it is fires, floods, extreme heat, melting of glaciers in the Arctic. Many of these are either induced by or accelerated by climate change. And we have very recently the Working Group 1 report of the IPCC 6th assessment report that came out, and there's a lot of very interesting information in that, but I just want to bring out 2 important points. The first one is that it's very clear from that report, as well as from some other earlier reports, that we need to do deep transformative changes to reduce emissions in a major way. We also need to do substantial carbon dioxide removal in order to reach the Paris temperature goals. And what this report seems to be saying is that not only we need to do both, but both of those will be very challenging. And in fact, even doing both together in an intensive way may not even be enough. So the task ahead is really huge. And that is the context in which we're having this discussion. So with that, I will now cut down my talking, and I hope that our discussants can engage with their perspectives. And I have a sort of an initial question that I was planning to ask each of our discussants. But before doing that, I would like to ask Jan, because Jan, you've been involved in the various IPCC activities. If you could just share with us just 1 or 2 minutes of some of the key points that you feel would be relevant for this discussion from the Working Group 1 report that was published early in August, just quite recently. So Jan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Janos. First of all, maybe to highlight the Working Group 1 in the IPCC is the working group on the physical science basis. So the solution space is mainly explored in Working Group 2 on adaptation and Working Group 3 on mitigation. So a lot of important issues on carbon dioxide removal are still under investigation because those working groups have not published their reports yet. This is to come next year in spring. So, but the Working Group 1 report also I think brings some important messages again to us. One is very simple on the carbon budget. It provides new carbon budgets, and the remaining carbon budgets is the amount of carbon that we can still emit, basically to keep warming with a certain probability below temperature thresholds. And what policymakers are particularly interested is well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degree. And the message again is the budget for 1.5 degree is very small, 400 gigatons of CO2 that we can still emit. That is roughly or less than 10 years of CO2 emissions until basically that budget is used up. And that already highlights how important the issue of carbon dioxide removal is if we want to achieve the most ambitious temperature targets. I think that's an important message coming from this report. And then secondly, it also says a few important things about the temperature response when you go to net negative emissions, that for smaller amounts of net negative emissions, this response is roughly linear, which is good news. Because there is a question of how the temperature response is when you want to pull back temperatures again, and so that's a good message. But in terms of its overall impact, as I said, a lot will be said when Working Group 3 particularly is coming out, and I hope for a similar discussion that we have after the 1.5 report, the special report on limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, which I think was really important for the discussion on carbon dioxide removal, because it clearly flagged up that without those capabilities, we will not meet that challenge.
Thank you, Jan. And this is helpful. Sort of more substantive context about the report. And I'm glad you raised the question of the net negative and some good news also about the linear response. So in fact, let me go now to you with the first question I was planning to ask you. And let's start on this. Let's continue on the positive. That is, let's assume that the world is on track to reach global net zero emissions in 2050. All the transformative emission reductions and removals that were needed will have been done, and residual emissions have been taken care of. And then the world is facing this scientific fact that the world actually needs to go net negative. And we need to start removing carbon from the atmosphere at an absolute level in order to maintain the Paris temperature goals. So the question to you is, why is it important to consider carbon dioxide role in these net negative emissions post net zero when thinking of and designing carbon dioxide removal policies today?
I mean, first of all, I would say there's the issue of scale, right? If we also have to do net negative emissions, it also means that we need more carbon dioxide removal overall. So we need to have a larger capacity, and I think that's the first important thing. The second one, I would say, there are also kind of unique governance challenges that are coming with that, because if we are in a net zero world, roughly there will be some residual emissions, and we may still have carbon prices, but those will not provide any longer for actually financing carbon dioxide removal activities. So in that sense, per se, net negative emissions means that we need to think about how we will provide those funds, who will pay those. And this whole issue of finances is a unique challenge in the context of climate change, I would say, where we usually have said, as for example, as economists, we can we just do it with carbon prices and that's fine. Then we can finance emission reductions at the scale required. That no longer holds. I would also say that if we broaden the perspective, that there are important with the capabilities of the world, but that also means individual countries to go net negative. A lot of important discussion also, that are happening in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that are taking place will change a little bit, I assume, because, for example, with this capacity, there is in principle the possibilities that, for example, individual countries could offset their or could raise up to their entire historical responsibility, not necessarily in terms of offsetting, but in terms of burden sharing, right? So there might be a new burden sharing discussions, and we need to anticipate this, I believe, because I think it's a discussion that is unavoidable, and it's an important discussion. And of course, the big fear is that this will slow down climate diplomacy, and so I think anticipation is always good in such a case, and I think we need to anticipate this. And now, János, I have to disappoint you a little bit, because I will go back to your positive spin of this question and just question that a little bit, because I think we are not living in this world that you describe, and I think that is a really fundamental point for me also when I talk to people. So we are not in a world with transformative emission reductions and removals right now. And particularly in carbon dioxide removal, I think there is a big innovation gap. We know that we will need the capacity to remove carbon dioxide removal within the next 10 to 20 years at a gigaton scale. And at the moment, we are nowhere close to get there. And if you look a little bit into the literature on innovation, and you think about the timescales that are involved in those, then this is really breathtaking. Think about the commercial solar cell. The first commercial solar cell was part of the US space program, actually, in 1958 or something. And from there, it took about 70 years until we really had solar cells being competitive in the power market as a source of energy, and still we are not in a two-digit share at a global scale in PV contributing to the in the power sector. And if we now take this and say, okay, now we had with Climeworks the first commercial plant, and we say, okay, from there we take 70 years, then we are far too late. We don't have that time. So we really need to appreciate that we have to very thoroughly think about how we can accelerate innovation in that space. And sorry for being a party breaker there, a party crasher, but I think for me it's a very important point, because I think some of the governance challenges are related now in this space, accelerating innovation for CDR.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I must say I share that with you. That was an assumption for the question, just to be very clear. But I actually have a follow-up question here to you. There were one more issue that you raised, but I come back to that later on financing CDR. That's a separate issue. But for now, you describe this as a very challenging situation. And my question to you is: do you see enough of the leaders, either of governments or private sector, actually talking about this in a way that it might spur the kind of action you were suggesting, for example, in the UNFCCC? Because I don't see it yet, but maybe you see something better than I do.
I mean, like I would say, where I take a bit of hope is really the private sector. So I find it quite impressive what Stripe is doing, like with the kind of Silicon Valley kind of learning curve approach, you know, trying to fund technologies that really put away carbon for a long time. And I think that's an interesting approach. And, you know, saying that, you know, at this moment in time, we fund your demonstrator, even if it, you know, costs $2,000 to remove a ton of carbon, but you need to show us how to get within the next 10 years under $100, and selecting projects on such grounds. So I really think that that we need at this moment, we need to you know, behind that is this kind of portfolio approach that you invest in a broad range of options. And that is actually, I think, the type of thing that we need and see, you know, what technologies really show the learning and the speed that we need. And this is one part of encouraging, or this is encouraging from my point of view, to see that. And Stripe is not the only one. There's also Microsoft, you know, there are others. And I think the other thing is that, of course, there is a huge demand for offsets. So at this moment in time, we, you know, we have, I believe, Oxford University came up with that number that 20% of the largest 2,000 companies or something like this have already net zero goals. So maybe those numbers are wrong, but it's nevertheless an immense demand for offsets that we at this moment in time we cannot we cannot satisfy, right? We cannot supply those, but I think that's a positive thing because there is demand. And where there's demand, there are market forces, and I think we need market forces in order to get a grip on this problem. On the government side, you know, there are, you know, some things that that we are seeing, but I think that's moving, from my perspective, too slow. And I would hope for a more ambitious approach, particularly also in the European context.
Well, thank you, and you whetted our appetite a little bit about the role of the private sector, and I'd like to move now to Suchi and ask her how you see the role for the public sector on the one hand and the private sector on the other hand in doing the challenge that Jan described, scaling up, coming up with the new techniques and so on. How do you see that? And if you could share a few thoughts with that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say, I think the role of the public sector spans a lot of what Jan was talking about when it comes to financing, when it comes to accounting, when it comes to public engagement, when it comes to international cooperation, and when it comes to innovation. And I think it's an expansive role, but I think that's the responsibility of the public sector in this space. And so I'll start with kind of some of the more Department of Energy specific aspects of this. I'll say, you know, in the role of scaling up, you know, not only does the Department of Energy in the United States fund R&D to help reduce costs, but also to fund demonstrations, right? This is the riskiest area of CDR. And so, you know, it's the role of the government to help mitigate that risk. You know, we are seeing this infrastructure package in the United States. You know, it hasn't passed yet, but if it does, it'll be the biggest global investment in CDR in history. Not only does it have $3.5 billion for direct air capture demonstrations, but there are prize components. There's $2.5 billion for reliable storage, which is absolutely essential to have true removal, and countless other investments across the technology spectrum. And so that is something that is absolutely needed. And without those kinds of investments now, we can't get to the scales that we need. And so, agreed with Jan in the sense that we're not there yet. I think the government is absolutely essential in getting there. And for the United States, I think this is the first time we've really been able to have serious conversations about what the role of the United States is in the CDR space. In another vein too, I think the interesting thing about deploying CDR is that the industry doesn't really yet exist. So, we have the opportunity to think through creative governance and ownership models that may not follow the traditional public-private sector roles that we've seen in other industries. And that's obviously an incredibly early conversation, but I wanted to put that out there because, you asked about what the role of the private sector should be. And I think that's something that we still need to decide. I think that's also a huge role of civil society to be engaged in those conversations, to have conversation around what creative structures and what innovative governance structures could look like if we were to have, for example, public ownership around CDR. And I think, a key difference here is that there's no market to do CDR right now, and that's a problem. And so that brings me to another role of the public sector, which is to create policies and incentives to actually allow the private sector or any other, actual, CDR actor to employ it. If there's no incentive to do so, we will struggle in getting this up to scale. And that absolutely has to come from policy. That has to come from national and international governments. And so, and finally, I'll just touch on a couple more quick things. So in the space of accounting, Jan talked about offsets, and that conversation is rapidly growing. And I'm deeply concerned that we don't have robust accounting frameworks on a national or international scale. Without that, offsets aren't necessarily true offsets. And I think that's what we're seeing right now is that, in the United States right now, offset investments are burning in wildfires. How are we supposed to be able to talk about what offsets really mean in carbon removal if we don't actually understand what accounting needs to be taking place? In my opinion, I think that is the role of the federal government, to set those standards and also to have public oversight over an offset market that might exist. And finally, on public engagement, when it comes to governance and the public sector, it's not just about moving technological innovation forward, as you said, Janos. It's also about ensuring responsible action. And I think a big part of that is public engagement. It has to be a priority. Decision making has to incorporate community and stakeholder input in order not just to have public buy-in, but also to have public support and actual, true involvement in building this industry. I don't want, I don't want this to be top down. I think the scale that carbon removal requires means that the population absolutely needs to be involved with how that happens, because this is going to be too large scale for it to be just a government top-down approach. And so I think we have both the opportunity and responsibility to do that the right way, and to do it in a way that actually improves the quality of life for countless frontline communities, especially those that have borne the burden of the legacy of the fossil fuel industry. I think it's time to allow those communities to have leadership in this space, and I do think carbon removal really allows for that conversation to flourish.
Well, thank you. And there are a couple of interesting points that I'd like to follow up on right now. The first one, I think the way you put it is very interesting, that there is no industry and there is no market yet. And maybe you could just say a few more words. I mean, you alluded to how that might evolve with, let's say, government role and also the civil society role. But if you could say a few words on how one goes about that, because there are a few companies in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world who are engaged. There are a few civil society organizations who are engaged. So how do you see this moving forward tomorrow, next week, next month?
Yeah, I mean, within the next month, I think something like the infrastructure package really motivates new conversations. Investments in these early stage technologies moves us forward to having more companies wanting to engage in this space. Right now, with such little federal investment, international investment, it's really difficult for companies to come online and demonstrate technologies that cost billions in this first of a kind demonstration plant. And so I think having the government deeply involved starts to rapidly change this conversation. And I think, it's my hope that we will see that evolve over the next several years. I think something else the government can do is, really motivate international cooperation around innovation to help this become more of a global industry. I think so. Something that's a good example of that is, recently the United States announced that it's going to be launching a mission innovation for CDR that will be, launched more formally at the COP. And so seeing something like that, where we are partnering with other countries to, promote innovation in a more inclusive way, I think will also be a really big part of that. And finally, just kind of building off of what I said, I think incentives for this work is going to be essential, because right now we don't have a price on carbon. And so why would anyone have the motivation to remove carbon if there isn't policy behind it, whether that comes in the form of requirements or incentives? I think that that's a conversation to be had that, Congress, the United States government, and other international governments need to have internally. But without that piece, there is no motivation to do that work, because carbon removal exists to remove carbon from the atmosphere. It doesn't have any inherent value in a market sense. Obviously, it has deep value in a climate sense, but we have to put that value on for carbon removal from a government perspective.
Can I just chime in
Sure,
there, just to avoid any misunderstandings? I think I absolutely agree with you. There is the role of the government is critical. And what I find interesting in this discussion about carbon dioxide removal, and I'm definitely talking here more from a European perspective, that we have this basically as a science-led discussion, interestingly, also towards policy, for, I would say, up to 2018, 2019, with the SR 1.5 report, where we try to explain why this is a really important thing. Now we can really see that in policy, this is an issue that has been taken on. So that's a really good change. What you're saying, these investments in demonstrators that are now really important to speed up the development of our capabilities to actually remove large amounts of carbon, has in the first instance taken over, by some private sector actors. This is what I wanted to say, but they will not be solving this problem for us. That is really clear, and I completely agree with you. Governments now need to take this on, and I think that is the number one important issue. And here in Europe, I would definitely say progress here is too slow to meet, our targets that we have subscribed to internationally, but also nationally. In Germany, for example, net zero in 2045. That means, we have quite a big industry base. We will have considerable residual emissions. We really ought to do something to have those capabilities at our fingertips.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, there was one more thing, Shuchi, that you raised, but I would like to park that for a moment. That's the question of accounting system, MRV. We'll come back to that, just like climate CDR finance. But I would now like to turn to James and ask you, we talk a lot about these carbon removal, which probably will end up being quite expensive. So I guess the question I'd like to ask you is, do you see carbon removal as necessarily a drag on economic development, or is it perhaps something that could be looked at as an economic opportunity? And how do you see this, particularly in the sense of the global south, and more specifically in the Africa region, which have, of course, contributed a lot less to the depletion of the carbon budget that Jan talked about at the beginning? So any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Janusz. That is the crucial question. This is a global crisis at the end of the day. And I think one of the most critical traps for us to avoid is turning this into a dialogue between Europe, the US, maybe the OECD, occasionally with a debate between the OECD and the next wave of high emitting emerging markets around the question of just who caused it, who is to blame, and so on. That is an important conversation to have. Unfortunately, it has tended to be 100% of the conversation that we are having. And frankly, when it comes to the question of the survival of the species, it is an important, but not necessarily the most important question. Left aside is a very cold, thoughtful assessment of what are the most economically viable ways to remove carbon dioxide at scale from the atmosphere. Because if we're trying to get to net zero and we're hugely positive, so we've both got massively positive flows and huge positive stocks, then anyone who understands the number line will know that in addition to cutting down our flows, we need to think about negative flows from day one, because every avoided emission ton is the same as any removed emission ton. And there's a whole set of moral arguments about which one we should focus on first. But when the ship is sinking, we don't say everyone should focus on patching and no one should focus on bailing out the boat. We say everyone should be doing something. And the danger with the current framing is it consigns massive chunks of the world's surface area and huge chunks of its population to being entirely bystanders and victims in the carbon conversation. Because we're saying, you all don't emit very much, so you've got nothing to cut. And any conversation is about small gifts of money to make up for the guilt of those who have become wealthy on the basis of destroying the environment. We are not having a conversation about who can do the most quickly to help address the problem. And I think until we break out of that trap and are genuinely as ruthless about carbon dioxide removal opportunities as the fossil fuel industry that got us into this mess is ruthless about carbon dioxide emission opportunities, right? So you don't have Standard Oil saying, well, we found oil in Pennsylvania, let's just focus here. The oil industry goes global, finding the most cost-effective geological and other spatial factors to enable the production of their chosen product. And that thinking is sadly missing in a lot of the early conversations about carbon dioxide removal. In addition, there's a tendency to fall into a trap. The newest, shiniest part of the carbon dioxide removal conversation is engineered solutions, right? And the technologies around those. And to make carbon dioxide removal entirely synonymous with that, it's an important area and potentially an area that has transformative capabilities. But to make the entire conversation about engineered solutions ignores those instances where nature-based solutions, perhaps tweaked or managed nature-based solutions, which we haven't really tried, have a major role to play. And what I mean by we haven't really tried is when we talk about nature-based solutions, we have generally talked about let nature take its course. Let's step back, let's expand the rainforest. Or well, we're not yet talking about expanding rainforest, we're just saying, let's cut it down less. And then we step back, or we say, well, let's plant some trees, but we don't actually treat the carbon dioxide yields, if you will, of these various activities as agnostically as we should if we really believe we're in an existential moment, which demands both innovation in engineered solutions, really understanding and breaking down the drivers of their costs. So for example, we talk about, some, costs in the region of $500 to $1,000 a ton, maybe even more for engineered solutions today. But when we decompose that, we realize a good chunk of that is driven by the fact that if you're using an emissions heavy energy grid to run your carbon dioxide removal, you're having to remove more because you're kind of, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. What we don't do is then ask the next question is, what about places where we have large amounts of undertapped or underused or underdeveloped renewable energy potential? Would that reduce the amount of going forwards and backwards? And then I'm sitting in a country like Kenya, which has an 85% renewable today, 85% renewable energy grid, and has tapped only 5% of its renewable energy potential, including baseload geothermal, 20 gigawatts of it just sitting in the ground, ready to go. And I'm looking at an equation that says this stuff is really expensive because we have to do 3x the amount of chemical reactions that we otherwise would if we had a completely green source of energy and the basalt to place it in. Well, that tends to coincide with geothermal conditions and so there's a little bit of a tunnel vision that says, well, these technologies are being developed in place X. Let's look at their economic viability first in place X and then scale them up globally, versus saying, what are the cost drivers and where are the best test beds for rapid scaling? And the drivers could be labor costs, could be land costs, could be renewable energy costs, could be a whole range of others. Separately, when you look at the nature-based solution side of things, we fail to ask the basic question, what if we were investing at the same scale and with the same rigor in nature-based solutions as in engineered solutions? And the knock is always the absolute disaster that the current offset market has become, with bullshit credits, pardon my French, floating around. But that is a fixable issue. That is a regulatory issue. Let's get to clarity on what a real credit looks like. Let's recognize that there is risk. Any asset can be destroyed. Yes, assets burnt down recently, but risk-adjusted value of assets is something the insurance industry has been thinking about and managing for eons. So why are we not bringing that rigor to thinking about those solutions and then saying it's not just about let the forest grow, it is what are the fastest carbon removal nature-based systems we could have, and to what extent can they be deployed? And that brings me to my last point, which is, interestingly, if we really look at it in this way, in this economically ruthless way, and I'm using ruthless for a reason, this is not about let's be kind and bring on other people onto the game, it is let's play to win. And that means bring the best players onto the field. And that demands that we take a look at questions such as, if we're being ruthless about this, what are the economic uses, right? So for example, 40% of new urban build in the world between now and 2050 will be in Africa. Pivoting 50% of that from traditional construction, steel and concrete, to wood, cross-laminated timber, which sequesters some of the carbon dioxide that you just removed, and also creates an economic value of large-scale forestry, gets you from something like 15 extra gigatons to -7, right? That's a 22%, that's a 22 gigaton swing from just focusing on saying, how do we shift building codes? How do we shift building technologies and link that to carbon dioxide removal through, massively scaled agroforestry in places that have the land, have the labor, and have the upcoming demand. And so we really do need to think like entrepreneurs, not just as scientists, not just as regulators, but as global entrepreneurs looking for the best opportunities to generate a return from climate action.
Thank you, James. And I really appreciate the opening of the debate a little bit broader. I think this is really interesting. There are two issues that I'd like to follow up. One on accounting systems, you also raised it. Let's park that for a second, because a number of questions have come up with that. But the one important follow-up I'd like to ask now is, how, in terms of governance frameworks, how do you make this happen? Because as one thing is to have an opening of the vision, of looking at the economic activities and so on, but how do you make this happen globally, or specifically in the region where you normally are, and you talked about Africa quite a bit?
Janusz, I struggle to get past the idea of a well-determined price for emissions of carbon dioxide in general as being the thing that's on the critical path. Mm-hmm. Because that creates a predictable, if we can figure out and be consistent about it, because what we now have is a range of prices, which for universal global good makes no sense. The carbon dioxide molecule sitting in the smokestack of a German power plant is the exact same one being pulled into a mangrove in Indonesia, right? And so on some level, we need to me, critical path lies along this question of how do we align on a single shared understanding of the economic value to humanity of carbon dioxide removal or emissions reduction. And those are just two sides of the same coin, tomato, tomato. It should be a number that is largely the same. The only reason it would be different is not a scientific reason, and Jan, you may correct me on this, it's a political reason. So solving that political reason and then figuring out based on that understanding, and yes, the easiest, we do want to focus a lot on emissions, but we want to really invest and create price certainty around the opportunities in removal. Because there are places in the world where there is a willingness to potentially invest or engage in these areas. People are looking for new economic opportunity, but there's no certainty of a subsequent market. And in the absence of that, it remains a cottage industry. And having something so key to human survival as a cottage industry seems like both a missed opportunity and a moral disgrace.
Okay, well, thank you. So there are two particular topics that we parked, and I would like to come back to them. One is on finance and the other one is on accounting systems. But before doing that, I would like to just ask you if you have any questions to each other, any follow-up, any points that were not clear or something that you have a different view. This is a good moment to do that. So I see, Jan, you're already getting engaged there. So if you want to start, go ahead.
Yeah, only James, I largely agree with your assessment. The only thing that I was a bit asking myself is, you say, you have that we have this bias towards kind of engineered things, right? Versus natural-based solution. I don't see this actually. Actually, I take now a German, very much a German perspective, and what I've experienced here with stakeholders. I think nature-based solutions are very fashionable. So it's there's a big buzz around them, and I think we rather have the challenge in Germany to actually to start a discussion about engineered things, because we have our forests at the moment are for example very fragile. In our German climate law, we only talk about natural things as as bringing the removals, and I think that is really dangerous. So both in terms of quantity being too low, but also about everything being brought about by one set of solutions. And I think we meet again at the place where I would say, of course, we need to have an open mind how we do this in terms of a good balance. And I think that was the thread you were following, right, between engineered and nature-based solution. But I would say, from my perception, it's really community-driven. So the NGO community, even internationally, I perceive as very nature-based solution. And then there are other communities which have other biases. And so I think maybe we are just in a global dialogue in starting to think about the issue. But I cannot perceive one particular bias that is generically there and one set of solutions being taken out of the bill. So it's for me it's a very crowded place still, this discussion around carbon dioxide removal.
So I agree with you, and I think there's a helpful clarification there. I think the NGO realm, a lot of the social sector buzz is around nature-based solutions. I do think some of the new capital, and not surprisingly given its nature, drawing a lot from Silicon Valley and elsewhere, has really very quickly gravitated to the biggest, shiniest, most capital-intensive machine, and not looking at the whole spectrum. And I think there is a spectrum all the way from let's not cut down the rainforests we have or manage the grasslands better, all the way to how do we manage natural processes, potentially very rigorously and industrially in ways that generate returns. So I'm by no means just saying it's all about just biodiversity and so on, but I do think that there's a spectrum there. And unfortunately, unless we can get the major allocators of capital to think about the whole spectrum, one portion of that spectrum will remain the province of, like I said, non-scalable cottage industry, which is not what we need. But I think your correction is well taken.
I totally agree, James. And I'll add too that I think there are different biases across different sectors. And like, for example, in the Department of Energy right now, direct air capture is something that's getting a lot of attention. In my opinion, there are it of course needs attention, but we need to be careful that we don't choose winners and losers here, and that we are ensuring that we are funding all potential options to get to the best price fast as possible, and that is actually leading to true removal. And so that's something that we are very conscious of, and I think something that needs to be a bigger conversation on the international scale, because I think these biases are different in different places, and as you said, James, I think there is a bias towards some nature-based approaches in the NGO and civil society sectors where there's not necessarily a recognition of the industrial scale and supply chains needed to maintain those particular approaches as well. So I think there needs to be a broader recognition of different kinds of biases that are inherent across sectors. And I'll say too that, I think there are approaches that a lot of these sectors, both public, private, and the NGO sector, haven't grappled with yet, like ocean-based CDR, which is starting to bubble up a bit more in the conversation, which has deep governance challenges, huge potential scale, but hasn't quite entered the conversation in the same way to even have biases on either which way, other than having very little attention at all. And so I feel like I agree with both Jan and James in that we need to start confronting our biases a little more carefully and ensure that no one is picking winners and losers across the entire, diverse space of CDR.
I find this discussion very interesting, the biases of different groups of stakeholders, and very much confirming what Suchi, you said earlier about the need for the different stakeholders to engage in conversations and maybe exchanging ideas about their biases and learning from each other and so on and so forth. So this is there is a lot to do there. But unless you have any other particular question to each other, I would like to go to the finance issue, because James, go ahead, please.
I did want to pick up something on Shuchi, your point about the biases. One that I touched on that I would love to hear your respective reflections on is the degree to which nation state boundaries are being treated as boundary conditions in the engineered space. So there's something about engineered versus nature-based, and then there's a whole other question about a lot of the assumptions. I remember having a conversation with an investor in one of the direct air capture business models. And when I said, well, have you thought about, the applicability of this elsewhere? I said, well, no, we want to first prove it in whichever country they were in. I don't, there's few enough of them, I'll be telling you which one it was. And then I said, but one of your key boundary conditions, one of your key cost drivers, if I understand it, is something that's a direct product of where you're doing this. I said, well, yeah, but there's lots of places in the world that don't have those conditions. Have you thought about doing it in any of those places? And it seems like, we may end up with we're trying to maximize each individual country's collective use of its natural and human capital resources towards carbon dioxide removal rather than optimizing globally. The design can come from one place, the manufacturing can come from another, and the deployment can be in a third. And unless we build those muscles early, the engineered space might collapse under its own weight, because some of these costs are going to be really hard to address.
Yeah. No, I mean, I fully agree with you. I think this is one of the biggest challenges of CDR, because it's addressing an inherently global problem on a very individual local scale. And I think, the hard part about building this industry is that we're following models that we know. And I think, and I mentioned this earlier in my comments, that we have the opportunity to build new models. Like, what does public ownership look like? What does international ownership look like? And I think these are key questions that I think we finally have the opportunity to bring to like the UNFCCC that we haven't really had before. And it's, my hope that we can actually start fully engaging in that space to allow CDR to flourish in the way that it needs to be able to do exactly what you said, James. Because I think, yes, we need to ensure that we are also allowing other countries to pick up on the early investments that countries like the United States is doing. I do think that the United States has a lot of the investment opportunity right now. And I also think it's our responsibility to do this early investment in CDR. But I also want to create better structures for tech transfer to other, international players that have exactly what you said, the resources to build it out. Like, we should not be limiting that to, the United States market. It doesn't make sense. And so I think the really tricky part is having that conversation in a way that actually builds frameworks that allow us to do what you said. And I think it's going to be very hard because we are so entrenched in the models that we know. But I hope, both this year, but also in the rest of this administration, that this is something that the United States pushes forward in having more creative conversations around CDR, because it's not like any other industry. It's really not like the electricity sector. It's not like the fossil fuel sector, and it shouldn't be. It's completely different. So.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, let's move on a little bit and come back to a couple of issues that were raised about financing carbon removal. And I see two issues here, and I would really appreciate your thoughts from either of you or all of you. First of all, there's a question of, is the financing of CDR any different than financing any other climate action? And if it is, what are the differences? So the nature of the financing of a particular set of techniques and the related social activities that one needs to do. But then secondly, and this was raised also by some of you in the earlier discussions, how does the North-South issue come into this, if it does? What do we do with that? How does, what ideas can we come up with, and what thoughts can we come up with, including those that might find their way into the UNFCCC climate finance discussions or elsewhere in relevant international fora. So this issue, the two issues, one is the nature of carbon removal financing, and the second is the North-South dimension of that. So any of you would like to have a go at giving your thoughts?
I can jump in really quickly on the latter question.
Please do.
I think North-South dynamics are such an integral part of this conversation, because CDR, I think, is integral to global climate justice. And so ensuring that we are weaving that justice piece throughout the CDR conversation, I think is just, I think we're not paying enough attention to it yet. And I think that needs to be a much bigger part of the national and international conversation. But I think the dynamics between, North and South on CDR are, again, just, very different than we have for other technologies. I think we have the opportunity to benefit the South by investing in these technologies, and also by enabling the South to build their own sectors as they see fit for themselves. I don't want this to be a situation in which, the United States is building things elsewhere for other people without their consultation. I think it needs to be a different type of conversation where we're facilitating the transfer of technology and ideas, but enabling any country to pursue whatever options it sees fit for itself, and then to do so in the framework of an international agreement or conversation around CDR. But so I'll just say that I just think it's a very hard problem, but I want it to be very different. And I'm hoping that the dynamics that we have right now, we're not forced to live with the dynamics we have now. We have the opportunity to change them, and I think CDR can be a vehicle to change them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll pick up on that because I really agree. I think so. I'll start on the same topic and then maybe come back to the financing question. Part of the challenge I see in the North-South dynamic in general around CDR, but around climate more generally, is that because of the asymmetries of power and the absence of real quantitative rigor around it, it becomes a conversation about moral obligations. And those are really hard to negotiate. Those are really hard to, any action that I undertake on the basis of your obligation to me is going to be discounted by how much I trust you to behave in line with your obligations. And so, what you end up with is this grudging negotiation where everyone kind of will say the right things, but is anyone really willing to put the resources on the table that can help make things right? And I think that we need to migrate that discussion from being one around obligations to being one about transactions. One that says, here is a specific remedy or a specific action that will be undertaken in return for a specific investment. And the reason that's important is that is morally unsatisfying, first of all. So let's accept that that's the case, right? There should be obligations flowing in various directions because, there are asymmetries in terms of, of responsibility. But setting that aside, once you move into the realm of transactions, you get into the realm of innovation. You can get into the realm of entrepreneurship. You get into the realm of new, unanticipated generated solutions and ecosystems, and so on. And the thing that moves you from obligations to transactions is price, which brings me back to what the difference is between the CDR market and other aspects of the climate discussion. I think it's all being hampered by the fact that we recognize this to be the biggest single threat to humanity. And yet, for a range of political reasons, we are not willing. We price everything else and recognize the impact on GDP growth, on specific industries, on jobs, but we have not been willing to come up with that single number that is gettable, that would actually allow us to balance the ledgers and create the beginnings of a global market in climate action. And without that, we will continue to underinvest, both undercompensate the global south for the harms they're suffering, as well as underinvest in the potential opportunities in capital scarce regions. And it stands to reason, the best opportunities to deploy capital are always where capital is scarcest. That's just logic, right? Your best marginal return on capital involves going where the capital is rarest. The issue is because we cannot link this to a return, we can't build business cases. If we can't link this to a credible, predictable long-term return, we won't be able to build business cases and we will not scale. So no price, no scale would be my provocation.
If I may add some more aspects, like in principle, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's what economists have been saying, and rightly so, right? What I would say is, what I would also say is that we are that carbon prices are not always ideal in situations where you're dealing, for example, with long-lived infrastructures. Prices are not always as efficient as we would hope, because maybe partially due to the issue of price certainty, because it really over very long periods of time nobody feels that there is actually this certainties that we would really anticipate those investments. Maybe I don't know for sure, but that's a bit of my feeling. And the other space is, and this is I think very relevant here, is of course when we have a market for innovations, and I think just the price signal will not be sufficient to actually trigger to bring the technology through the valley of death, and to bring them in a situation where they can actually compete. So there is, as Shuji said before, there is this important role in particular of governments to actually now help companies to grow, develop a market with them, and make sure that later on prices can do the work. I think secondly, so the unique challenge here, I would say, is that we have to do this in a very, very short period of time. And I think that is extremely challenging. And I think that's even more so than for conventional emission reduction technologies. So Janosch, this is, I would say, one thing that's particular. And the second thing, I said that earlier, is the situation when we have net negative emissions globally, where in principle, we are in a situation where we are potentially thinking about something that needs to be, subsidized because we are not generating anymore the carbon prices to actually finance that. So I think these are two particular aspects that I would say in terms of technology development and deployment at scale that are quite unique to this CDR space.
So maybe I'll just interject really quickly because I agree a lot with what you said, Jan, but I would offer a couple of modifications. So one, price is necessary, but by no means sufficient. Two, there's a whole range of public goods, universal public goods or positive and externalities that are funded. There's a mechanism for that. It's called taxation. And if we all agree that we would like to take out more carbon dioxide, then our governments should say we will continue to pay this much for the removal of that carbon dioxide to whoever can do so, and tax us all and pay for it. So when I say price, I don't just mean a free-floating price set in the market. I am saying just a predictable or some price signal. And that speaks to the other point, which is, yes, it's good for there to be long-term price certainty. In the last 5 years, the price of oil has gone as high as $120 for a few moments at one point in time, a barrel, and as low as negative $5 for a few seconds last year. And yet the global oil industry has suffered its hits, but has continued to invest and has continued to grow. We kind of need to look at our mirror image industry and understand the ways that it uses price and the ways that it doesn't use price, because there's an unrealistic expectation of, well, I need to be absolutely assured of my return. No, that's why it's a risk, and that's why you invest rather than expect a guaranteed return. So I think a price helps. It's not a magic bullet. It still requires a whole range of mindset shifts, and it does not take away the role of the state to tax and regulate, but it is a necessary building block that we can't engineer around.
I'm mindful of our time. We have a few more minutes before we need to wrap up, and I do want to also just quickly look at this question of accounting systems, monitoring, reporting, verification. A number of comments during this discussion were made in this regard, that they need to be made more robust to reflect the large amounts of carbon that will be moving within countries, but also between countries. And so my question to you is, how do you see this happening? Because since a lot of it could end up international, there has to be some level of international discussion, agreement of this. And at the moment, there is little happening in this area. Any reactions there?
I can jump in. I think in terms of, the US perspective, I can say that I think we need to tackle this on a national scale first because of the kind of accounting issues and the offset conversations happening in the United States. By no means is that I want to delay an international conversation on this at all, but I think federally it's something that we need to figure out within the US government first. I'll say too that I think there is an inherent difficulty in creating standards that make sense across CDR approaches. And so it's just of immense importance to start this conversation as soon as possible because it's so hard to have. And I think it's going to take time to ensure that we have high quality standards that just make sense from soil carbon sequestration to direct air capture. The monitoring, reporting, verification, durability of storage questions are totally different for soil than they are for direct air capture. And so how do we ensure that we have standards that make sense across all of this? And so I think that's something that takes a regulatory approach, but also an innovative R&D aspect, and making sure that both of those are happening in parallel is something that I think from the Department of Energy perspective, we're really excited to pursue.
Thank you, Shuchi. And Jan, James, any very quick reactions on this particular topic? Jan?
Yeah, I mean, it's really this complex issue to re-emphasize. I think what you hear when you have this when you listen to those discussions is, you know, that people talk about carbon dioxide removal or negative emissions as if they had vanished, right? But the complexities are really related to the fact that, you know, we have as Shuji said, that we have a whole range of technologies that are very different in terms of their average storage and also their reversibility. So, and we need indeed to have a monitoring, reporting, and verification system that can deal with all these intricacies, and that is highly complex. And we really need to start this discussion because otherwise we will not get anywhere. This is the most fundamental things, and I think also in the German and European context, this is an issue that now needs to be urgently tackled, and we are seeing not enough movement at this moment in time.
Okay, James.
I think for me, all I will add is, the interesting thing about it is, I think the urgency is clear. It's actually one of the few topics that solves a problem for each of the parties around the table. And what we need to get some of the parties, particularly in multinational, multilateral negotiations, to understand, for example, for the Global South, is why is this topic really important? Because it could shift the very nature of the ongoing interactions, which I think are a bit frustrating very often, because it always comes back to, well, whose fault is it and how much will they give us, rather than what kinds of, can we really focus on creating an opportunity here that might allow us to actually tap in on a different basis.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much. This has been a fantastic discussion. We have a little bit of time left, so I would just like to ask each of you 30 seconds or 40 seconds brief last points that you would like to share after this discussion. And I'd like to start with James this time.
You know, Africa is the youngest continent, and many other parts of the global South are really, really young. Right now, that's a problem because of the young unemployed people. We need to give them a mission. And I think carbon dioxide removal is an inspiring mission to give to a generation that says, you're not just stuck with the consequences of history. You have a mission over the next 30 years to stay under that 400 gigatons and actually expand that space over time. That could be compelling, that could be exciting, that could be something that gets people up in the morning.
Thank you. Suchi?
I love that, James. And I'll just say, you know, from the government perspective, I think we are at an incredible moment with a huge opportunity and responsibility to move this conversation forward. I think we've waited a long time for this. We've waited too long, in my opinion. And I think it's time that we make the deep investments we need to, and that we actually come together as an international community, which I know has proven difficult in the past, but we don't really have an option anymore. And we're seeing that this year, over the past recent years, that this is no longer something that we can wait on. And so I hope that in this administration, we can really make the strides that we need to kick off building CDR out at scale.
Thank you. Jan?
Yeah, there's not much more to add, but I would highlight, I think the urgency of making progress is really still underappreciated in science and policy. And I think that is something that we need to address. And the second point that I would make is, and I think we've also heard this today across the board, there is no silver bullet. We need to invest in technology portfolios, and we need to be open about the solutions and see what works under what conditions, where and why, and really go for those.
Thank you, and let me share with you also 2 or 3 points that I picked up, not as a summary of this incredibly rich discussion, but just a few thoughts. I think the first one perhaps is that there is a crisis, there's a challenge, but I heard a lot of very interesting ideas about opportunities that could open. If we just open our vision, if we just look at the roles of different stakeholders in a slightly different way, then there are incredible opportunities here in the next 10 years. We don't have a lot of time, but there is a lot that one can get going and then grow from there. So that's one. The second one is that what I haven't heard, but I heard the need for, is much more conversations about these issues at various levels between various stakeholders to bring this up in the political agenda. In some cases, it's moving forward quite well. In others, not yet. So again, there is quite a bit of work that we have to do. So I leave it at that. Thank you very much for this very rich discussion. And we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. So let's go and do that. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janos.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.